I'm Marshall Kozloff.
And I'm Mike Duran.
Welcome back to Counterbalance.
Marshall, today we have as our guest my good friend Ephraim Inbar. He's the president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He's a longtime veteran analyst of Israeli foreign policy and former professor at Bar-Ilan University, author of many books and articles. And on top of that, he's a nice guy, or at least he projects himself. You know, he plays the role of a nice guy. I have no reason to believe that he's not. Ephraim, welcome.
Thank you. My pleasure to be on your program.
Ephraim, why don't we start with you just giving us a sense of who's winning this war between Israel and Hamas?
Well, as Chu and I used to say, it's too early to say. But basically what we see so far is that the Israeli Air Force is pounding Hamas targets. It destroyed much of its military infrastructure, be it launch pads, be it headquarters, communication systems, its tunnels, and also succeeded, according to the IDF, also to eliminate close to 150 Hamas operatives, including some of the higher military echelons. So if it goes by that, so far, so good.
So in his first question, Mike referred to who's winning the war. Oftentimes, and by definition, war has objectives for both sides. What would you say is the Israeli objective over the past 2 weeks, and what is the Hamas objective?
Well, the Israeli objective is quite clear. We have actually no political goals. We do not want to push Hamas out of Gaza. We have no beliefs that we can change the view of Hamas toward Israel. And the only thing we can do is an expression that Michael heard from me for some time, to mow the grass, basically to destroy the capabilities of Hamas to harm us. So this campaign, like similar campaigns in the past, has very modest goals, and hoping that we will be able to restore temporary deterrence until Hamas will forget or internalize the price they paid in this conflict and go back to harm us. We understand that the motivation of Hamas is still very high, and the only thing we can do is to limit its capabilities to harm Israelis. This is the whole philosophy of mowing the grass.
And quick thing, what is Hamas attempting to achieve in its actions?
Hamas, first of all, wants to convince the Palestinians that it is the Palestinian body that is carrying the flame of resistance against Israel. So the first goal is domestic politics within the Palestinian entity. Second, it wants to portray itself as a defender of Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa. This is why the first salvo they fired of missiles, they fired toward Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day that the Israelis celebrated. And they also have to please their basic desire to kill Israelis. So the more they kill, they see it as a better result of their military campaign. Similarly, another goal concerns the international community. All Palestinians, including Hamas, believe that the Palestinian issue is not high enough on the international agenda, and they want attention, particularly the attention of the Biden administration, that similarly to the previous administration is less interested in pushing for what they call a solution to the Arab-Palestinian conflict.
Ephraim, if you were a Hamas leader, Sinwar or Deif, sitting in your bunker right now, talking with your top advisors, assessing the campaign so far, do you think that they regard it, in terms of the goals that you just mentioned, as a success or as a failure?
I don't think so. I think they were successful, first of all, to remind everybody that they are the only ones that fight the Israelis. Second, I think that they were successful, at least partially, to portray themselves as caring about Jerusalem, not just being focused on Gaza. I think also that they succeeded also in damaging, to a great extent, or to some extent, Israel. They, of course, part of the country is paralyzed economically. We do not have many casualties because of the successes of the Iron Dome system. But basically, there is some damage, which Israel can sustain. And also at the international level, everybody is busy with trying to bring a ceasefire between the two rival sides. So, definitely they have some successes. Also, it is worth mentioning that despite Air Force, strong Israeli Air Force that is operating in the skies of Gaza, the number of missiles that have been launched to Israel is continuing more or less at the same pace.
How exactly is that? So at the start of the podcast, you described the impact on Hamas at the leadership level, at the tactical level, especially. How are they continuing the same pace of rocket launching?
They have accumulated over time. I don't know exactly. I didn't count their missiles, but according to some estimates, they have 15, maybe 20,000 missiles. They shoot every day, maybe 100, 150. So they still have time to go. And also, this shows that clearly that you cannot win a war by air force, which is a lesson that some Israelis don't want to learn. But obviously, there are limitations to air power. And we see part of those limitations. They also understand very well that Israel is reluctant to invade Gaza with a ground force because we have a clear dilemma if we invade and conquer the Gaza Strip, which is doable at a certain price, which maybe it's not excessive, but what do we do with Gaza afterwards? Okay, we conquer, we clean the Gaza Strip of Hamas. Let's assume we kill the whole leadership, but we should not forget that a new leadership will emerge. Unfortunately, the Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza, like Hamas and their ideology. We shouldn't forget that Hamas was elected democratic election, and they are still there. And if we know that Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority leader, canceled the elections, Palestinian elections, precisely because he knew that Hamas is going to win the next elections. So I'm sure there will be another generation that will be a Hamas generation. This is the region we are living in. One of our prime minister quipped, Israel is a villa in a jungle. So this is a jungle around us.
So a pretty bleak picture. Do you think that the IDF was surprised by any of the capabilities that Hamas displayed in this round of fighting?
I believe that the IDF was surprised by the decision of Hamas to start the war, basically. The evaluation in the Israeli intelligence seems to have been that they are deterred and nothing is going to happen in the near future. And they were proved wrong, not for the first time. In terms of their capabilities, I don't think there were big surprises. We knew more or less about the range of the missiles, the payload. We knew about the tunnels. We have a pretty good picture of where the tunnels are going. We knew about their naval capabilities. We destroyed. We had the intelligence to destroy a mini submarine that they were trying to send to our gas rings. So I don't think there are many surprises in the pockets of Hamas, and we know they are determined to continue to send the missiles against Israel. They don't care about the people. They use the people as a human shield. And, if Gazans are dying, particularly children and women, this is a bonus for Hamas. They can get better pictures to convince the world that, they are the small, weak party that is fighting against the Israeli Goliath, which brings them points in the international media that is foolish enough not to distinguish between the bad guys and the good guys.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I had the impression, and I don't follow military assessments closely, so it's just an impression I had that the ability of Hamas to launch so many missiles simultaneously was new. Am I wrong about that?
I'm not sure. I think that they have learned from previous experience that one way maybe to overcome the anti-missile system we deploy is by saturation tactics. So they are sending now, close to 100 toward a certain site in order to overcome it. It doesn't really help much because we made improvements over time in the Iron Dome system. I don't think there is much of a surprise. Their greater number is also a function of the more numerous missiles at their disposal. Basically, they have many more missiles than in 2014, for example. They have a much greater capability for self-production. And as a result of that, they have more missiles. Also, they were successful probably also in smuggling more missiles from Iran. But no, I don't think that there is something dramatic in what they are doing against Israel.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is the point that you don't perceive Israel as having a political objective in regards to the current conflict. There's obviously the slightly cliched phrase that war is politics by other means, and then you are then invoking the idea of like mowing the lawn. So mowing the lawn, if we're using that metaphor, suggests the grass will go back. So in terms of the long-term picture here, is the assumption then that this is effectively the type of conflict that is just going to continually pop up every 2, 3, 4 years once the grass goes back?
Yes, you are correct. I think that this whole notion of nation building, power is totally wrong. I think the Americans have learned the lesson, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. There are people that you can't fix, and they are going to be maybe eternal enemies. Eternal maybe is a strong word, but they are going to be your enemies for a long time. And Hamas is this type of radical Islamist, very ideological organization. And they grow, they have a very good education system, by the way. Not the education system I want for my kids, but they are able to implant into their kids exactly the messages they want those kids to grow up with. And we can see, small kids, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, saying, I want to be a shaheed. I want to die, to kill Israelis. And this is part of their good education. And it's a pity that this is how they educate their children. But it is effective.
So you mentioned that they get their weaponry from Iran. And from my point of view, that is the issue that the United States should be most concerned with. That is to say, I personally frame this as a proxy conflict between Iran and the United States security system. And I think that, you mentioned that the IDF was surprised by Hamas's decision to launch this war, that the picture they had assumed that they would never do this. I think that the timing has everything to do with the arrival of the Biden administration and its, for lack of a better word, appeasement of Iran, is not actually, it was timed to Jerusalem Day and the conflict over the dispute over the houses in Sheikh Jarrah and so on, for propaganda purposes. But the strategic decision making was made on the basis of conversations between Hamas and Tehran. And even if I'm wrong about that, even if the local issues surrounding Jerusalem were the ones that drove Hamas to make the decision to push the button, from an American point of view, the strategically significant fact is that Iran is behind Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad even more so. And that's the one that America should be focused on. How would you react to those claims of mine?
Without going to the specifics of Hamas-Iran cooperation, I think you are definitely right. I think that Americans do not recognize that Iran is a revisionist power, wants to get rid of the Americans in the region, wants to minimize American power. It sees American as a dangerous state with corrupting cultural effects on their people. These aspects of the relations between the US and America are not well understood among Americans. And it's a big mistake on part of the American administration to reach an understanding with Iranians on their terms. This is what the Obama administration has done with the JCPOA in 2015. By the way, even the Trump administration wanted to go back to this deal, an improved deal, to reach some kind of dialogue with the Iranians. And Biden administration is not that different. I think it's very naive to believe that if you reach a deal with the Iranians, they are going to keep it. I think this goes against the cultural American environments that you shake a hand with a man and you have a deal, and it doesn't work like this in our part of the world. They are much better, negotiators. At Macy's there is fixed prices. In the bazaar of Tehran, you negotiate all the time, and after you finalize the negotiation, you start renegotiating again. So, it's an entirely different mentality, and America simply is ignoring one kind of rival enemy it has in the Middle East with tremendous ambitions. Iran is a former empire with imperial ambitions, is a revolutionary country with a goal to bring its revolution to all over the world, and if needed by sword, in the Muslim tradition. And Americans simply don't recognize it. They want to get rid of the Middle East, to get out of the Middle East, which I might understand, but at least they should let its allies to do the job. And it seems that the Americans are incapable of understanding, what balance of power really means. And so it's a pity. Having said that, I would, if I go back to the specifics of the Hamas is not a 100% Iranian proxy. It has its own autonomous decision making, and I think that the timing was result of the annulment of the elections in the Palestinian territories. They hope to win in the domestic arena, and as soon as they realize that they cannot do it by elections, they decided to choose an alternative way. We should pay attention that other Iranian proxies didn't join. Hezbollah is quiet. So I'm not sure that the whole thing was orchestrated in Tehran, although I'm very sure that the Iranians are not sorry what they are seeing in our area. And I would like to point out to one additional Hamas achievement is to bring Arab Israelis into the streets and go on a pogrom against their neighbors, Jewish neighbors. Of course, not all Arabs in Israel are of this kind, but there is a minority that has been radicalized and is causing a serious internal problem of Israel. It is an awakening for many Israelis, and it is at a time when the Israeli political system was more open than ever to Arab political participation. And actually, for the first time, the Zionist parties considered the inclusion into a government of an Arab party, a Muslim Brotherhood party, actually. So this is very troublesome for the Israelis. So this is definitely one part of the ongoing war which didn't play well for Israel.
Speaking of how things are playing out for Israel, we focused a bit on the US, but can we just discuss the broader international reaction to the conflict and how you perceive Israel's standing with the various interested parties, and whether or not that standing, whether it's in the press or whether it's what's actually reflected on the ground, to the degree to which that matters?
Well, for most Israelis, the word international community has no meaning. What really counts is Washington. For us, And so far, Washington has displayed goodwill toward Israel. Maybe in order to be able to feed us afterwards, a very bad deal with Iran, maybe. But so far, the American position is satisfactory. It also stopped anti-Israeli resolutions at the UN. About the international world, international community, there are large parts of the world that are very pro-Israeli. I talked today, just before this meeting, with an Indian crowd, Indian intellectuals. They are all very pro-Israeli. In Asia, most countries are pro-Israeli. South Korea is the most pro-Israeli country in the world, more than the United States. In Eastern Europe, many countries are pro-Israelis. Austria, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, the prime minister office of those countries put an Israeli flag during the confrontation with Hamas. So not everybody is anti-Israeli. It's true that part of the third world, what's called the third world, and of course West Europeans, are not very friendly. The media is not friendly because it has a blurred moral vision. Unfortunately, the international media is not trained to distinguish between righteous and evil. And I think in the case of the Israeli-Hamas confrontation, there is a clear righteous side, it's Israel. And there's a clear evil side, which is Hamas. Hamas is shooting at civilians in purpose. Their goal, as I said before, is to kill as many Israelis as possible. They don't distinguish between civilians and non-civilians. And still, a part of the international media is reporting with a great bias against Israeli action. But, we are used to that. Jewish history teaches us that, many of the Gentiles don't like us. So what's the difference? The only difference is that now we are strong and can defend ourselves. So we prefer to be strong and disliked than be liked and victims.
Can I take you back to this question of the violence on the streets of Israel, which was a new element, especially for this the Gaza conflict. I was particularly surprised by the violence in Haifa, a city that I've spent a lot of time in, and I think of the relations between Arabs and Jews in Haifa as a model of coexistence. What's your assessment of the attitudes among the Arabs who are participating in violent acts? Should we and let me just add, not just in Haifa, but also against the background of what you mentioned, I think we've seen in the last decade or so an unprecedented level of Jewish Arab coexistence and cooperation, not just on the political level, but on the economic level and in cultural level as well. I mean, all kinds of I see all kinds of signs of a pluralistic of a improvement in the pluralistic cooperation in Israel in recent years. So it comes as kind of a surprise. Do you think that the Arabs who are engaged in violence are primarily motivated from a political jihadist point of view, or is there something else going on in the society, other fissures that we're just not aware of, or that I'm not aware of?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth mentioning that the large majority of Arabs in Israel have not participated in this type of violence. And the minority, I think, can be divided into three parts. I don't know if equal parts, but more or less. First of all, there is a religious element. And the Muslim Brotherhood, what we call the Northern Branch, was definitely active in those violent activities, and they have instigated and incited against Jews. So this is one element. Another element is a nationalist group, which also was partly radicalized, and it's there among the Arabs in Israel. And the third part, and this is something that maybe could have been prevented, is the criminal element. In recent years, we have seen a tremendous rise in criminal activities within the Arab sector, increased violence, increased shootings, increased victims, number of victims. And it was clear that something is going wrong there. And Israel tried to bring in more police. We built police stations in many of those Arab villages. They were initially treated with great suspicion. And of course, there is less trust between the Arab community and the Israeli police than there is between the Jewish community and the Israeli police. So maybe you could have done a better job in jailing or preventing this type of level of violence within the Arab community, intra-Arab violence. And indeed, this was a surprise for most of us. I think that those events will be investigated by specialists, by scholars. I would say also that we've seen in recent years a growing number of Arabs, maybe 25%, that identify first as Israelis and only afterwards as Muslims or Islamists or Palestinians. So as a growing Israelization process, as you mentioned, among the Arab community that is almost fully integrated in the Israeli economy. I live in Jerusalem. Wherever you go, at whatever level of service you require, you may see Arabs, and of course they get the same salary as Israelis. They are treated by the Jews exactly as their Arab colleagues. And this also contributes to the surprise that Israelis share nowadays.
So that's a good thing to pick up on something you said earlier, which was your point about Arab parties getting reconnected into the political system in terms of the coalitions. What do you think is there so let me put it a better way. You were referring to there was progress and optimism on that count. Is there a point of no return where the current conflict and the current tensions can derail all of that progress? Or is this something where once things settle down again, the situation will improve?
I think that eventually the cooler heads will prevail. For how long, I don't know. But people want to live a quiet life, and particularly if they see more policemen on the streets. And I think that one lesson of these events will be an increase in the number of the Israeli policemen. The Israeli police force is very small, relatively. So my feeling is that things will go back to normal, at least a facade of normality. Many relationships, personal relationships, will not be restored. Jews definitely are more suspicious now about Arabs in Israel. They will be more reluctant to go into an Arab village and do shopping. Some of the relations will not be repaired easily, but life is strong. You need your neighbors sometimes, and sometimes some neighbors are nice, and some neighbors are less nice, and it doesn't go along to always along to ethnicity. So it's you have to live with a national conflict. Basically, it is not a minority like you have Indians in America, or you have I don't know Hungarians in Romania. They are a minority, but they don't see themselves as part of the enemy of the state. It's more a Kashmir type of situation. There is a tense coexistence. Sometimes it's more tense, sometimes it's less tense. But I believe life will go back to normal. The police definitely restored law and order.
Let me ask you about Israeli politics against the background of this conflict. I was talking to a friend of mine from Turkey, and he was explaining to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu ginned up this conflict in order to save himself politically. Now, of course, he got that argument directly from the pages of Haaretz, which the Israeli media does a good job of feeding this kind of these kind of theories. I don't believe that, but it certainly seems to be the case that that this has given Prime Minister Netanyahu a new opportunities to fight another day. How do you assess it right now? How do you assess the general political situation in Israel, but in particular, Prime Minister Netanyahu's ability to form a government or take Israel to a fifth election?
Well, first of all, I would advise everybody to read Haaretz with a grain of salt, and particularly when it comes to Netanyahu. Obviously, this war has eliminated the possibility to have in the near future a coalition with an Arab party. Despite the fact that the leader of this party courageously went to a mixed city, Lod, and went to visit a burned synagogue to express his solidarity. He went with the mayor. And he seems to have good intentions. Of course, he wants to be part of the government because he wants money, but this is perfectly legitimate. So
you're talking about Mansour Abbas,
right? The leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Southern Muslim Brotherhood branch in Israel. So the government still is under Netanyahu. I've seen since yesterday rumors that there is a possibility that a party that split from Likud under the leadership of Gideon Sa'ar may join a Netanyahu government in order to prevent fifth elections. We are not only the chosen people, we are also the choosing people. So it's because of the emergency situation. I don't know if this will work out. Netanyahu seems to be ready to adopt a rotation arrangement with Gideon Sa'ar, the leader of the splinter party, in order to bring him in and for him to be prime minister in the second period of the rotation. So if this will happen, this is a positive result of the war. And I think we need a government. We didn't have a government, for 2 years. And people think it's a wonderful thing to be without a government. But there are some disadvantages. No budget, certain things don't work. For example, my institute we do research for the military, and they don't have money. So to pay for research, so we are creative. So they give us reserve days. That's one way to pay people in Israel, and it shows the creativity of Jews in the land of Israel. So without money, we invent money. But it's a very, this lingering crisis is a big problem, and it of course, as far as I'm concerned, it affects national security. Maybe this lingering crisis was another reason for Hamas believing that we will not react as strong as we did. And Netanyahu, he's called as a magician, a political magician. He's indeed, a very successful politician, also domestically. But I doubt very much if Haaretz is correct about his great talent to collude with Hamas in order to have a national security crisis to make it easier for him to form a government. But it helps him, definitely. I don't know if it will bring about a government. We'll have to wait and see.
So as we're at the end here, it'd be great to have you sum up takeaways for the audience as they're thinking about how the next week, 2 weeks, month will play out. Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? How are you coming down on the challenges that are coming up?
First of all, I'm an optimist by nature. In Israel, you can't be a pessimist for too long. So I think that we prove to everybody that 3,000 missiles make only a small dent in Israel. That's important important message in our neighborhood. A second important message is that somebody that tries to harm us gets a bloody nose. This is also a very important message, in our region. If we got an important warning about the Arab minority that we'll have to deal, in the future to make sure that they are not constituting an internal security threat, this is also a positive thing. The economy functioned well. We continue to export. We see no emigration. I met this morning a lady that is a new immigrant. She admitted to be shaken by each, missile salvo but she's here. And despite missiles, we stay put. This is an important message. I think for the IDF, it's important to understand that tremendous air power doesn't do the trick always. You have to, if you want something very bad, and you have to send in soldiers to risk their lives. in order to get what you want. And we had an illusion, greatness of the Air Force. We need soldiers on the ground. I am a former paratrooper, so I know what it needs, to take care of the bad guys, and we have to do it, once in a while.
All right. Well, Ephraim, that was very illuminating. Thank you very much. And we hope to have you back as events progress.
I'm always ready. Okay.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, if you'd like to learn more about Counterbalance and the work of the Hudson Institute, you can go to hudson.org. We'll be back next week. We'll see you then.